Hey, well, what's up, Colliders? Welcome back to The Collision. Daniel here to talk about the new faith-based sports film, The Hill. It's hitting theaters this week. I've seen it, so let's talk about it. So if you're not familiar with this movie, it is based on a true story, kind of an incredible real-life tale of a young boy named Ricky Hill, who had some physical disabilities, was in leg braces, and yet had aspirations, had a passion for baseball. And this movie tells the story, sort of his relentless perseverance against all odds to pursue that dream of being a professional baseball player. I actually really enjoyed this film. I'm not, as you guys know from The Collision, I'm not always a huge fan of some of these kind of faith-based films, but there's a lot in The Hill to appreciate, to enjoy. It is a well-crafted story. It's a well-made film that does have a very wholesome and inspiring message, and just a kind of an earnestness to it, an elevation of goodness, which is refreshing against the backdrop of a lot of the other things kind of hitting theaters these days. So in one sense, this film has kind of all the expected hallmarks of the sports movie genre. In fact, it was actually written by the same screenwriter who wrote the all-time beloved classic Rudy, and you can kind of see some of that same influence and kind of storytelling sensibilities in this movie. And I think despite the fact that it is based on real-life events, if you've seen a sports movie before, you'll probably be able to predict most of what happens in this movie, which is not necessarily meant as a criticism. I think that the sports movie genre isn't one that necessarily always has a whole lot of surprises. It's more about the journey and kind of the feel-good moments and the inspirational kind of events rather than a bunch of like plot twists and stuff. So despite kind of a pretty conventional telling of what is admittedly a very unconventional real-life story, I think what elevates this movie is that it is very much the power of that message and kind of the strength of these characters. Because while obviously baseball plays a very central role in this film, it's often just more of like a backdrop to the more human, real-life, personal journey of Ricky Hill. You might say that it's less of a baseball movie with a bit of drama kind of added in, and more of sort of a human drama with some baseball sprinkled in, because I think there's only about two actual like baseball games that are shown, in the story itself, and even those games very much center in on like significant moments for the character of Ricky, rather than focusing on a more traditional of the clock's ticking down and what the score is and what the win-loss record of the baseball team is. It very much centers in all throughout this movie, specifically on the character of Ricky Hill. And I think if baseball is kind of one of the foundations underlying for this movie, the other one would just be faith. Ricky's father, who's played by Dennis Quaid, is a pastor in this film, and religion, spirituality definitely plays a very central role in Ricky's story and in his journey. And while the faith-based genre doesn't always necessarily have a high batting average of success for being able to handle sort of the more overt religious elements in a way that doesn't feel very preachy and heavy-handed, The Hill thankfully manages to avoid some of those same pitfalls. It doesn't shy away from the religion, kind of the spiritual Christian elements in any way. You have characters reciting Bible verses, you have characters praying, you have characters sitting through church services. So the faith element is very much front and center and kind of consistent all throughout this movie. But unlike some of the other kind of faith-based movies that I found a little bit more uninspiring, I never felt like the movie was speaking directly to me, and that the characters were the sort of mouthpieces for the filmmakers to preach their message. It does feel very organic that, hey, this is a conversation between these two characters about spiritual things, important kind of faith elements, rather than feeling like you're sort of transported into a Sunday morning service. And I think also, too, which is refreshing, is there is an element of sort of rawness and kind of authenticity to that faith element that is I think really well done. There's a conversation early in this movie, kind of a heated, tense conversation around a dinner table where all the characters are believers, but they're having some hard conversations. And it does demonstrate just sort of a level of like nuance and sophistication and depth in those discussions, which I think is far too often missing in maybe some of the other kind of faith-based films. The movie itself begins, kind of tells Ricky's whole life journey. He starts as a young kid, and then about halfway through this film, it does a time jump, and then it's sort of older teenage, senior in high school age Ricky. Actor Colin Ford plays kind of the older Ricky, and he is excellent. He definitely has the charisma and sort of the star power, I think, to carry this movie, despite being somewhat of an unknown actor. And kind of likewise, appearing in his second faith-based film of the year, Dennis Quaid appears as Ricky's father, and he's great. I found his performance in Amazon's On a Wing and a Prayer, which came out earlier this year, somewhat uninspiring, kind of stiff, not up to the level that I think he's known for, that he can act, his reputation. But he's definitely given a lot more kind of meaty, chewier material in this film to work with, and does show off his acting abilities in one of probably the most interesting kind of character role in this film. Although, speaking of complicated characters, Dennis Quaid's character may be the only one. I think one other kind of criticism I might have for this film is, and maybe it's a byproduct of the fact that the real-life Ricky Hill was involved in the production of this film and even appears in this movie as a character in a very good, very fascinating scene. But there is almost a sense of like idolization or just very lofty depiction of Ricky. He's almost too good. He's too virtuous. He's too noble. Kind of his only struggles that he has throughout this film is just that kind of against the doubters, and that other people don't realize this sort of how driven and how talented of a baseball player he could be and how successful he could be. And I don't necessarily think this is the kind of movie where I want the filmmakers to go and like dig into his closet and find a bunch of scandals or anything. It doesn't need to be that, but I do think that showing a little bit more of a rounded character, some weakness, some more internal struggle would have made his character's journey a lot more compelling, and I think just a lot more kind of relatable for the audience. As far as content to consider, things going on the surface of this, not very much. So sexuality, there's no sexuality. Violence, there's no violence in this. Language, really, there's nothing. There's a couple, I think, two uses of the D word, a kind of minor profanity in this. And then another scene, a young character begins to curse, say a word that starts with S, and then a stern look from his parents cause him to course correct and say shoot instead. And then there's just a handful of other like heck and darn and words that aren't profanities. And maybe the only other kind of crude one character, kind of a scout, speaking of a baseball player, refers to as he's got some big cojones on him. So there is that. But overall, this is not a movie that has a whole lot of harsh language or anything in it. As far as themes, kind of things going on beneath the surface of this film, probably the main thing that gets explored in several different ways is this sort of the contrast, the tension between like the spiritual and then like the physical, the immaterial. And you kind of see that on the most immediate way just between Ricky's sort of internal dreams and aspirations of being a baseball player, contrasted with the fact that he is in leg braces and he does have some physical shortcomings that conflict with those dreams. But maybe on a deeper level, the theme kind of gets explored through in the sense of like God's call for Ricky and how he can glorify God. Because Ricky very much feels called to baseball, although his father, again played by Dennis Quaid, is a Baptist pastor who views sort of his son's physical disabilities as a clear sign that instead of baseball, Ricky should just focus on following his footsteps and being a preacher and sort of focus more on like the spiritual needs rather than trying to pursue what seems like a closed door of like physical aspirations. And kind of all throughout this movie, it shows that his father very much diminishes the importance of like the physical realm. There's in the conversation I mentioned earlier around that dinner table, kind of his mother-in-law kind of challenges him on that. She says, "Your eyes are so busy studying heaven, you don't see the misery you're putting your family through." And when he kind of counters and accuses her of lacking faith, she responds, "Faith is all I've got and it sustains me, but I live here on earth." And that very much is sort of the tension all throughout, and particularly with Ricky and his father, of how can you sort of serve God but also be present and kind of use the physical gifts that God has given him. And kind of in a pivotal moment, Ricky's father does challenge him, says, I give you a choice, God's will or your will, to which Ricky responds, I choose both. So that does become sort of the through line of this whole film of, hey, how can we use our own gifts, our own talents to glorify God and kind of on this earth and not just sort of focus purely on just kind of more pastoral or more the spiritual. And the film doesn't necessarily diminish or the importance of that calling. Ricky's father is shown as a flawed person, but also a shepherd that cares about his congregation, that does care about their needs. So there is some nuance to the portrayal, but I do think there is some interesting stuff for Christians to kind of take away and process with that. So in the end, The Hill, I think it's a good movie. I think it's not without its flaws, but hey, even the professional hitters only get hits 3 out of every 10 times. So there is some stuff in this that I think wasn't as developed or they didn't go as far as maybe they could have. But overall, this is definitely one of the better faith-based movies that I have seen in a while. It is a wholesome story, and it does very much kind of center in on sort of the uplifting journey and kind of the personal part without kind of losing that in just sort of the spectacle of a bunch of sports games. And it does, I think, maybe most importantly for me, it does demonstrate that you can, as a film, explore issues of faith and religion and still feel like a compelling story and not just sort of a Sunday morning church service. So then I encourage you guys to check this movie out. And if you do, let me know what you think. If you enjoyed this movie, if you're inspired by kind of this miraculous story, would love to hear your thoughts on the film. So jump in the comments section, let me know that. If you haven't done so, I encourage you guys, subscribe to the channel, become a Collider. I got a lot of other stuff going on here, movie reviews and live streams and interviews. I would just love to have you guys be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thanks for watching and continue to collide through World for Christ.